But more important than any other thing, which is where I'm going to end so that we can discuss briefly, is how do we read these representations, whether it's literature, theology, whatever. How do we make sense of them? And this is probably where you probably should hear me a little very clearly. I see some of my old friends on the platform. Thank you for showing up. Number one, about women in the Bible, and even generally about anything that you read in the Bible, you need to be careful about reading the Bible in general and about women in the Bible as a rule book. And I know a lot of us have been trained that way, right? Be very careful about reading anything in the Bible or reading the Bible as a rule book. And by a rule book, what I mean is like a set of already made ideas that is already prepared. It's just waiting for us to download them into our lives and go out there and do them. And it is by doing them that we are blessed, right? Just be careful of that thing, because that's what has caused a lot of troubles and problems in history. Because the Bible is not designed, first of all, to do that, right? It's not made to do that. There are very few things that I will be bold to say, this is it, this is not it. But this is one of the things that I can tell you for sure, that this is not the purpose of the Bible, right? The goal and the aim and the design and the nature of the Bible is not for it to function as a rule book where somebody will say, oh, look, Solomon had 3,000 whatever women, so therefore we all should have 3,000 women, especially as the men, right? It's very easy to do that because it's plain reading, right? If you're looking for a rule book which tells you what to do today and tomorrow and forevermore, it's really clear. You could just go there and pick up whatever nonsense that you see in the text and say, here it is. It's in the Bible, so let's go do it, right? But that's not how to read the Bible. Because if you read it very closely, it's much more nuanced than that. It's much more complicated than that. It's much more complex than that, right? So how do we read it? We read it as a tool for wisdom, as a tool towards wisdom. We read it by asking why, right? Instead of asking other questions that sort of lean towards what a lot of people say application, it's important to ask yourself, why are women represented in the biblical text this way, right? And it's in the asking of why that we are headed towards wisdom, right? It allows you to consider things like context, cultural context, historical context, and so on and so forth, right? It allows you to think of questions of equality and respect and justice and fairness, and what those things might look like in the ancient world versus how those things look like right now in our contemporary world, right? It is by engaging the Bible, by wrestling with it, by sitting with it, that we end up with wisdom, especially the kind of wisdom that is meant to give us, right? Because for me, the very first invitation that the Bible throws to all of us when we read it is not to first do it. It's not to first obey it. It's first to think. That's the clear invitation that the Bible throws to all of us. And I've said this a few times on other platforms. But the design and the nature of the Bible invites us first of all to think, to wrestle, to engage. Then obeying is at the end of the process of thinking and engaging and wrestling, right? A lot of us have been trained to do the opposite. Oh, the Bible is so clear on this. The Bible is that clear on this. The Bible said this and it's very clear. But when you look very closely, it's not as clear. So what does it on clarity tell us about the nature and design and the invitation that it throws to us? The unclarity of the representations of women, for example, the representation of slaves, the representation of men, the representation of power, of adultery, all this, the unclarity and the much nuanced dynamics of it calls and invites us, first of all, to investigate by thinking. And it's in thinking and wrestling that we end up doing, we end up with wisdom, okay? So in this case, how do we think about this? We think by considering context, right? What is going on contextually? What's happening, right? And especially in this, but let me draw it back. I went out, but let me draw it back as I end by saying that in this particular case with women, We are looking at reflections of the imaginations of the biblical authors as it shows, where they are culturally, right? As it shows what they thought of about women and of women in their particular context. It's very possible, and if read around, it is a quite daunting thing to do, but if you read around the cultural context of most ancient worlds, be it the world of Israel, the world of Persia, the world of Rome, it's just a general problem at that time in the ancient world that people had to deal with. When men were placed at the forefront and women were placed at the center. And so the various representations of the women that we see here are more of a reflection of the limitation of the culture and the context within which the Bible was set, than it is about it telling us how to treat and behave and handle issues about women in our world, right? And so if we can be able to make that twist and say, oh, I see the way Tamar was treated, and I see the way Hagar was treated, and I see the way Sarah is behaving in the text, and I understand it and I appreciate it because it tells me more about their culture than it tells me about how to treat women in my world, right? It's that place of thoughtful consideration of the cultural context, right? And there's the cultural context within itself, within the biblical text itself, let me say it again, the cultural context is represented within the biblical text itself, right? So you are not necessarily going to go into any other sort of textbook to read the cultural context, but we see snippets of the culture and the history and the social setting and the social systems within which these people were operating, left for us in the text themselves by the very representations of women in this particular case, right? So I guess the main point that I'm making here is the problem that we have of women being represented in very inferior ways in the biblical text is more of a reflection of the limitations of the biblical authors and the way they thought about things than it is about the Bible as a whole teaching us how to treat and handle women in our context. And for those out there who are looking for a rule book to download into their lives, already made, fresh, prepared, whatever, to download them and just waiting to do and to do and to do, then what these representations might do for you is basically make you a misogynist yourself, because you're just going to go out there and treat women anyhow. And your claim and your evidence will be that, oh, look in the Bible, Solomon did it. Look in the Bible, David did it. Look in the Bible, Abraham did it. Look, you're going to find evidence all over the place, but you're actually thinking about it completely wrong, right? The way to do it is to sit and to think and to reflect and to ask why. Why are women represented that way? Context is going to come up, and culture is going to come up, and history is going to come up. You're going to be like, oh, I see why. Because whatever is going on about women in the Bible is a reflection of, how it's a reflection of the limitations of their own culture. And so in our culture, how do we represent equality? How do we represent respect? How do we represent unity? How do we represent justice in our own cultural context? And it is in asking these questions that we are actually seeking wisdom, the wisdom that the Bible is designed to disperse and to share with all of us.